This is Fox 11 Forum, a look at issues of concern to Tucson and Nogales, with your host, Bob Lee.
Good morning. I hope you're having a nice weekend. If driving is in your plans today, perhaps you'll be listening to one of the many channels available via satellite radio. Maybe the oldies channel is your favorite. But before there was satellite radio, before there was internet radio, even before there was FM radio, there was AM Top 40 radio, an indirect result of the growth of television in the U.S. and helped along by rock and roll. In Tucson, we had color radio KTKT Channel 99 that churned out all the hits all the time. We'll have a nostalgic look back in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back. It was the mother of all pop radio formats, Top 40 radio. It was fast-talking, big voice, echo chamber disc jockeys. That was mandatory. So were the annoying jingles, hokey contest promotions, voice of doom newscasts, and of course the nonstop rotation of suit-defined or perhaps gangster-defined list of hits, often said to be 40, but many times way less than 40. But boy, did we teenagers dig it. I have some folks with me this morning, self-included, who were a part of this revolution, I guess we can almost call it. Ray Lindstrom is a former disc jockey, former KTKT disc jockey. Lee Allen is a former disc jockey, former radio newscaster, and really, I think, probably better known as a radio newscaster. But when you came here, you were spinning the hits on K-Cub, and
I still feel as old as Marconi.
And I'm Bobby Lee, bouncing Bobby Lee. From big old Happy K-Hoss, and one of the K-Cub bunch. Let's start by talking about what is. Very quickly, what do you think of radio today?
Is there still radio today? I'm not sure.
I listen at the top of the hour just to see what's going on in the world, and that's about it.
It's changed a lot, and there's still something that you can listen to without pictures, but it has changed dramatically. Let's take a look back and talk about how this all evolved, and keep in mind that when we're talking about and make references to KTKT here in Tucson, we're talking about the KTKTs that every city of 20,000 or more population probably had back in the 50s and 60s and to some extent into the early 70s. So it's your radio stations that we're talking about. It kind of got started in Omaha.
It did. It was a guy by the name of Todd Storrs who, you know, he liked to spend a lot of time in the bars during the day, and he noticed that people would play the same records over and over again. And he had an independent station at a time when, you know, television just hit and people weren't watching. Or, you know, of course, we used to actually watch the radio back in the 40s. You know, you'd sit there in your living room and you'd look at the radio.
You had a radio the size of a Humvee in the living room.
That's right. And you know, so the media had really changed, and people went to television. What do you do with an independent radio station? And he decided that he would make his radio station into like a jukebox and play the same 20 or 30 songs over and over again, the top hits, and he was a huge success.
Now, where did Gordon McClendon over there in Dallas, Texas, hook up with a guy in Omaha?
Well, of course, he heard what was happening in Omaha, and there were people all over the country that decided they wanted to follow this format, and he just refined it. And then, of course, it came to Tucson as color radio, and here was a guy by the name of Chuck Blower who decided, you know, to make it sound like color radio, real fast and perky, and all the top hits and that sort of thing.
When you and I arrived in Tucson, which was late 50s, early 60s, neither one of us did anything other than listen to KTKT at that point. What struck you about that particular kind of format that you still remember today?
Well, I was still close enough to being a kid, so I related very much to the format and the music itself. And while I was a part of radio in Tucson, I wanted to be a part of that kind of radio in Tucson.
Didn't we all? Didn't we all?
Every young person wanted to be a part of that radio, and I listened to it in high school, you know, like you guys did, and then as I got older, I wanted to be a disc jockey. That was the ultimate goal, and of course, you know, I worked for some of the other stations in town, and then finally I made it, you know, in 1962, made it to the big time, which was KTKT.
Windy Lindy in the evening. Now, one of the things that was interesting was the fact that it was music oriented, and it was certainly whether Todd and Gordon envisioned it initially that it was going to be this way, appealed to kids, a younger demographic, if you will. Not to say that I knew people that were my dad's friends that also listened to WSBA in York, and in my particular case, or KTKT here in Tucson. But as Lee mentioned, even at the top of the hour today, you still kind of listen to news. There was still news that was an integral part of this when, let's face it, as kids, you probably didn't care that much about news. Sometimes it was at the top of the hour. Sometimes it was 15 and 45 or 2020 news.
2020.
Why was news such an integral part of top 40 music radio?
You know, I don't even know how to explain it, except it just was. And you know, if you had a great radio station like KTKT, you had a news department. It was the disc jockeys did not do the news. You actually, and I think you were a newsman too, weren't you, at one time?
Oh yes, several times.
I was the weekend guy at KTKT.
You did have a news department, and we had a legendary newscaster by the name of Lloyd Couch that you had mentioned earlier. And he's the man who broke the news that Kennedy had been shot to the people in Tucson.
And he even interrupted a commercial?
He interrupted a commercial. I was listening to
Unheard
it.
of.
I was driving to the U of A, and I was listening, and I'll never forget. I was at the corner of Wilmot and Broadway, and I was listening, and there was a Kinney shoe commercial on, and he broke in the middle of a commercial for a news bulletin. Now, I don't care what, I said, my gosh, this must be a big story. How could he do that? You can always wait 30 seconds till the commercial was over.
Now that brings up
That's
a point. In terms of doing the news, what was the focus? Did the news department have something that a direction that they were supposed to go with in terms of what was in that newscast?
Well, I think anybody who remembers the station back then was, if you don't want it heard on KTKT News, don't let it happen. And we also, if I remember, paid $9.90 for the news tip of the week. If you saw something happening, you were supposed to call up, and at the end of the week, Phil Richardson probably asked for the dime back from the $10, but sorry, Phil.
Well, I think, too, that there was a commercial connection, because I know one of the things that they had was they had a contract with Harbor Tire to sponsor news bulletins.
Yes.
And you had to have a certain number of news bulletins every week. So we were all on the alert for car crashes and anything else that we could call in and get that mandatory Harbor Tire spot on it as well. So there was probably a commercial consideration.
Bob, you had asked the earlier question about the identity of news and top 40 and DJ, et cetera. I think it was all part of community orientation. We were Tucson radio. No disrespect to any other station that may have been on the air.
That's right.
We were Tucson radio.
And unlike so much of it today, which is off the satellite, it was all local. We were there. I mean, the newsman was there. The disc jockeys were there. All the people worked there. Most of the commercials were local. It was a local deal.
Yeah, there was no network newscasts on many of the stations. There was no syndicated news presented. You're absolutely right. And there was sound. We had to get voices in the news. We did interviews.
Right.
You had to get sound.
And it was geared toward local. In other words, the beginning of the beginning of the show was the beginning of the news was a local story generally.
Do you remember such a thing as a mobile news cruiser? Do they have any of those in radio anymore? KTKT used to have one.
KTKT had one, you bet. And they would cruise around and they would go out to a story.
Call letters on the side.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. And you still see some of those around.
I still remember the 1961 Lark that they traded out.
Trade out. Yeah, you advertise and I get to eat at your restaurant free.
Right. Had a lot of those.
Yeah, that's gone by the wayside also. We're going to come back and talk about some of the hokey contests and promotions, and we'll do that in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about Top 40 Radio and its impact on really radio and a lot of things today. My guest, Ray Lindstrom, a former disc jockey at KTKT. Lee Allen, former radio newsman at every station in town like me. Talking about star DJs, and as I read that, I was trying to think of who left this market and really went on to some significant fame. And the guy who comes to mind didn't work at KTKT. He worked at KIKX, which at one point was the closest thing that KTKT had to some significant competition. I was looking at a ratings comparison, and there was a couple of points where they really did get in KTKT's face, but there was a guy there who was going to the U of A, as many of the DJs in town were.
Right.
He used the air name Jefferson K here, but then he went from here to Boston, adopted the name Shadow Stevens, and a lot of folks who watch game shows and TV probably still recall Shadow Stevens. He even made some movies and whatever, and he's probably the one who really went on to greater fame nationally, although lots of folks went to bigger.
Well,
bigger
Lou
markets.
Waters, was a disc jockey at KTKT, and he went on
and
to be an
he got
anchor
his
at
first
CNN.
TV job at KVOA TV. Thank you very much, Lou. When he needed some extra change, as many people
Joe
did.
Howe was a Superior Court judge in Phoenix, and we've had a lot of people that have had. We had a couple guys go to prison, and
contests and promotions. Got to move this along, folks. Contests and promotions were a huge part of this. Some of them were pretty hokey. You got some trivia.
well,
here.
in the early 1960s, we would have contests and promotions. They would kind of be part of, if there was a local news story. There was this big dog leash law back in the early 60s. A lot of controversy about it, whether you had to have your dog on a leash or not. And two of our disc jockeys, of course, Frank Killa was probably the most famous disc jockey ever on KTKT, and Jerry Stowe, and they had a frog leash law instead of a dog leash law. They had a frog leash law, and this was part of the advertising material report. Pin the leash on the frog.
That's a pretty scary looking frog, too.
Oh,
It
yeah.
should be on a leash.
One of them espoused the fact that these made great pets at home because they could be trained, etc. And the other one took the aspect that they were ferocious beasts.
That's right.
And Jerry and Frank would go back and forth on that.
So one night, some old farmer comes in, and I was just getting off my shift, and he says, "I got a big sack of frogs out in my truck. Do you want them?" And I said, "You bet." So I got the janitor to open up Frank's office, and I put in about 100 of these frogs. I think it was little tiny frogs. These are these huge, slimy bullfrogs. And when Frank came to work the next day, he just about went berserk.
Opened up the door and they all went boom.
But anyway, that was just one of the things. We used to have the Indian in a snake, Chief Wachikanoka in a snake down at Southgate Shopping Center. He'd be in this pit full of snakes, and we would interview him, and that was always a big deal every year.
What was the point of the contest? Why were these things done?
Just to get people to talk about the radio station. Of course, everybody had this on their car in the 1960s.
Don't
This
honk.
was the famous KTKT bumper sticker, and or I should say rear window sticker. And the disc jockeys, we would go out, and every time we'd see one of these, we'd write down the license plate. And then if you heard your license plate and the description of the car, if you called within a minute, you would win some fabulous prize, like a T-shirt or who knows, an old record or something like that. But that was always a big deal.
Fabulous prize.
I'm surprised they didn't have you call within 99 seconds. Because
that
it was a
probably was
constant
it, now that I
refrain.
think about it.
Probably
right.
used at one time or another.
Yeah, that's right.
Like all things, Top 40 also evolved from what it started at in the mid-50s to the mid-60s. There's a guy named Bill Drake. We talked about Todd Storrs and Gordon McClendon. Probably the next most influential person to come down the pike was Bill Drake. What exactly did he bring to the Top 40 format?
Well, I think it was still that same fast pace. But I think one of the things that's really important to talk about is the fact of what the music was. It was Top 40 music. It wasn't any particular genre of music. It was what was popular. So you could have the Singing Nun. You could have Percy Faith, the Rolling Stones, the
Hank Williams.
Trashmen, Hank Williams. You could have all these people on the Top 40, and we would play those records. Whatever was popular was played. It didn't make any difference what kind of music it was. And I don't think there are radio stations, except for oldie stations, that do that today.
Oh,
It's either rap or easy listening or classical or whatever.
Or
But in
any
those
number of
days-
niche genres in between those.
Right. But in those days, it was whatever was popular. That was it. And so, even though you were a kid of 16 or 17 years old, you listened, you liked Little Richard and you liked Elvis, But, you know, you'd hear Percy Faith and Theme from a Summer Place, or The Singing Nun, for example. I mean, huge hit, you know.
Yeah. And I remember it was, during the day, it may have been more heavily formatted with that repetitious top 20, but in the evening it lightened up a little bit. Ron Wiley, do you remember Ron from Midnight to 6 DJ? Ron would bring in a whole bag full of 45s from home and play whatever he wanted to. It was after midnight, he could get away with it.
We also had our answer to Wolfman Jack at one point, Johnny Rabbit. Lee Poole, who was Lee Poole during the day on weekends, and I think Lee even did news from time to time, but at night he was Johnny Rabbit and was really, really very good at what he did and took phone calls which sometimes got him into difficulty because they didn't do them on a delay then. With the British invasion, what impact did that have on Top 40? Because suddenly there's all these Brit acts that are coming in.
Well, I mean, they were hugely popular, you know. I mean, you know, you had the Beatles that started out, and, you know, I can remember I had the Top 40 show on Saturday, and I can remember playing the top 5 records on the Top 40 hit sheet. And by the way, we did have that hit sheet.
Let's see that hit sheet.
Yeah. Here was this was in all the record stores. This was a hit sheet. On one side were a picture of all the disc jockeys, and then on the other side was the KTKT Top 40, which, by the way, we would not play the entire Top 40. You know, we would play the records on the way up or at the top, but when they started to go down, we wouldn't play them anymore. So, you know, that's one of those little secrets of
Turn that around.
Let's
see the flip side again.
There's Frank
There's
Khalil
Mr.
in the corner.
Khalil.
There I am. I always looked old, didn't I? Jerry Stowe and Dan Gates. Dan Gates has been around here for a long time.
Dan Gates did voiceovers here for a long time.
And I listened to him when I went to high school. He's a terrific
Jerry
guy.
Stowe had Jerry's records out on Speedway,
He did.
too.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Certainly things began to change dramatically. What was the biggest shift? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Stay with us. We'll be right back. A little bit of a hint to the answer to my next question in that graphic right there. What killed Top 40 radio ultimately?
Well, I think primarily it was the advance of FM radio. You know, I was a disc jockey on KTKT FM in 1958 when I was in high school working for free, and nobody had FM radios. You know, it was just a classical thing, and nobody listened.
That's pretty much what they played on
Nobody
FM,
had it, but
classic.
all of a sudden there was this new sound, this FM sound. And the FCC made it easier for people to get FM licenses, and cars started getting FM radios. And I would say that was probably the big change. And then music started to change so that the stations were, you know, one was playing adult-oriented rock, and another one might play urban music, and another one was playing country and western. So that now the music was really being separated. And then the station, like KTKT, as we knew it, just couldn't exist anymore.
I think you hit on probably one of the most significant things, and that was when FM became available in cars. Because up until that point, it was pretty much AM, and when you could get FM, that was, because cars still is pretty much what drove radio listening. And I think the other thing with FM, you could do it in stereo, and by now everything is in stereo. And, and people wanted, you know, the 2 speakers and wanted the drums over here and the saxophone over here. And that probably had an impact too. You created a website, a tribute site, one of many, again, for KTKT. How did this come to be, and tell us a little bit about it?
I have a couple of partners. You know, since I used to be a disc jockey at KTKT, and then there are a couple other guys, a fellow by the name of Chuck Sims locally, who has interviewed a lot of the old disc jockeys, and then there's a fellow by the name of Charlie Brown, who, through his travels, collected all of these fabulous air checks from days gone by from KTKT disc jockeys. And the three of us, we kind of got together, and they asked me some questions about the way it was in the old days, and I kind of make websites for a hobby anyway. So we decided to pool our talents and make a website, and we've come up with KTKT99.com. That's at ktkt99.com. And on there, you know, disc jockeys, what are they doing now? You know, what happened to these guys?
Some of them
Where
are
are
seen for
they?
hokey talk shows like this.
Well, we've got air checks from you know, Jerry Stowe's air checks. We've even got a movie of Jerry Stowe when he was in the emu's cage at the Tidelands Motor Inn back in 1960. You know, we've got a tribute page to Frank Khalil. We've got all the decades represented. You know, the 50s, how it began, how it started. We've even got a rather bawdy interview with Art Linkletter on there.
Art Linkletter, and I'll capsulize it. Art Linkletter was one of the early owners of KTKT. He was long gone by the time the transition to Top 40 came. But exactly, there was some question, I guess, as to whether or not people at that radio station at that time were playing Jack Linkletter's record. And there was a legend that Art was ticked because that occurred, and in no uncertain terms he denied that, and you can hear it on the KTKT website. We'll show you that website in just a minute.